So now we're going to zoom in a little closer into the human psychology, human brain, human experience, and how it is impacted by our environment and the ways that we shape our environment, the ways that we design our environment, and what that means for us as designers. And there's a lot of research in this area, as you probably already know. There's a lot more that you can explore. It's a fascinating topic. And as I was just saying, it's so exciting to see how the field is exploding with new knowledge, with neuroscience and biology, and so many new insights that are becoming available to us now in this just the last 10 years or so. And we're learning so much more about how human beings experience the spaces around them, the environments around them, and especially specifically architectural and urban space, and what kinds of impacts it has on our well-being and on our ability to interact, our tendency to interact with one another, our tendency to do things like walk and share the public realm, interact within the public realm, all these things that the New Urban Agenda is trying to encourage us to do, trying to make our cities more successful in supporting all of these actions and interactions. And of course, this goes back to the middle of the 20th century and some of the landmark work that was done there. I talked about William H. White's work looking at how people interact in public spaces, in particular, the social life of small public spaces is a landmark study. And a lot more has happened since, and I'll just touch on a couple of topics. You're probably aware of the work of Edward T. Hall and many other people who have looked at how people interact with each other and how their spatial relationships are managed, and how we each manage our spatial relationships to one another when we're interacting, and how close we get to one another, and so on. Of course, now with COVID, we're really teasing out these variables and trying to understand how close we are to one another and how we transmit viruses and so on, which is not, of course, going to end with COVID. We're still going to be dealing with the transmission of pathogens. We always have, to one degree or another. We're going to have other pandemics. We're going to have, influenza continuing to be with us, and other pathogens as well. So we have to look at all of these factors when we're thinking about how we interact in spaces, in public spaces especially, and also how we shape those spaces and how we can provide ways that people can be safe and be able, as I said earlier, to have sociable distancing, to be able to interact safely with other people from a safe distance or in a sheltered way, in a way that is protected from danger, obviously from automobiles, but also from other kinds of danger as well, including crime and so on. And one other key finding, and this is something that I'm going to come back to, is that the properties that designers regard as important, and I say we as designers, are not necessarily those that promote human well-being and healthy interactions within the built environment over time. And so what do we do about that fact? How do we account for that and give ourselves a kind of corrective to make sure that we can integrate the judgments and the experiences of the users? Because after all, we're designing for the users. We're not designing for each other at the end of the day. We're professionals, and we have a duty of care to the people who are in our care, namely the users and the people who are in the public realm and using our buildings and so on. And we have a duty, I think, to recognize that there are things we can do that are more conducive to their well-being and also less conducive to their well-being. And I think we have to look much more carefully at that and look at the evidence of that. There are many studies that point out the divergence between professionals, planners, design professionals, architects, and others, and the public members of the public or members of the users, the community of users. And this is one example of that by Hubbard, looking at a specific difference, doing an environmental psychology study of the differences between different populations, looking at the different architectural stimuli and how they're regarded differently. This is a study by Gifford where he's summarizing and then in turn describing the work of Nasser, who was summarizing that architects did not merely disagree with laypersons about what they were experiencing, they were unable to predict how laypersons would assess the buildings. In other words, if you're trying to promote the well-being and the happiness and the satisfaction of the users, if you can't even judge how the users are going to react, that's a problem. So if we're ever to have more delightful building, more successful buildings in the eyes of the vast majority of the population who are actually using these buildings, then we need to work on this problem, as Gifford was arguing. This is actually a really interesting finding, and I think a significant one for those of us who are designers, planners, architects, people who shape the built environment in one form or another. And I think science is opening up to us a deeper understanding of what's going on here and how we can perhaps deal with this problem, how we can perhaps, as I said, offer correctives. A lot more studies have been done. There's another study by Gifford talking about the categories that people use and how maybe the language that people use is different, and that contributes. Here's what's called a lens model for understanding the differences by Gifford and his colleagues. Lots of other examples of that, and lots of other examples of what we might call evidence-based design. And this phrase comes from medicine, you know, the idea of evidence-based medicine, that you use research. Not all doctors are researchers, of course, but all doctors should be literate in the research. They should know the evidence about what are the outcomes of different procedures and different approaches, different kinds of, you know, surgical operations, different kinds of medicines, obviously, and stay up on that literature so that they can do the best job in taking care of their patients. That's evidence-based medicine. And actually what happened was, and I'm going to explain this and describe this in a little more detail in this talk. When architects began designing hospitals and healthcare facilities, they began to use evidence-based methodologies for the simple reason that if you want to make sure that the building design promotes health, then you need to look at the ways that you're designing the buildings. For example, if you want to reduce the amount of transmission of diseases in the hospital, pathogens like MRSA, some of these that are spread in healthcare environments, then you need to look at the research. And one example is that the one bed hospital room, although it's less social and the patients are isolated, and that's an impact, but it's also much more effective in reducing the transmission of pathogens. So that's an example of evidence-based healthcare design, which has become very, very important in not only healthcare environments, but now it's propagating out into other forms of environmental design, evidence-based design in urban design, for example, evidence-based design in other fields. This was a landmark study. I mentioned this study the other day, and this was a study by Ulrich in 1984, an environmental psychologist who did a very clever study. He took patients on a recovery ward, and just randomly they were assigned to different places within this ward. Some of them had a view out of a window to a natural environment, and others had a view of a wall that no natural environment. And he very cleverly looked at the outcomes of the patients, and lo and behold, he discovered very clear differences, measurable, statistically significant differences in the mortality, the morbidity, the degree to which they stayed in the hospital, their recovery time, their requirements for analgesics, painkillers, and so on were lowered. So this was a shock to everybody, like, wow, you can actually have a medical outcome just from the aesthetic experience that you have, whether you're experiencing greenery and beauty and so on, versus you're experiencing, a blank wall. And this was a real landmark study back in 1984. To make a long story short, and I'll come back to this point later as well, many other studies have confirmed and extended these insights that yes, indeed, the aesthetic properties of the environment play a direct role on our well-being and on our immune system and on our levels of stress and on many other measurable outcomes of our health and our well-being. Here's a really interesting, another example from my friend Con Steamers at Cambridge, where he and his colleague, Marilena Nicolapoulou, did a study of thermal comfort and found that greenery was equivalent to a degree or so in not in Fahrenheit, but in centigrade of thermal comfort. So in other words, you could have a degree warmer in a warm climate and have greenery and vegetation, and you would feel as comfortable as if it was a degree cooler of thermal comfort. That's pretty amazing. That means that just the thermal comfort could serve from vegetation and from greenery could serve to reduce the energy demand of a building quite significantly. The heating in the winter or the cooling in the summer. It could also greatly improve the external thermal comfort of people who are out in the urban realm. If they have greenery around them, they're going to feel more comfortable as a result of that. And there have been some other studies that suggest that this is a very real effect, that we can feel more thermally comfortable, warmer when it's hot, or warmer when it's cool, and cooler when it's hot. Than would otherwise be the case if we didn't have that greenery and that vegetation. So that too is a really exciting and amazing, really, finding that just having greenery and beautiful environments can make a difference in how much energy we need for our environments. So this is really the beginning of this field that's now referred to as biophilia. The idea that if we have greenery, if we have sunlight, if we have water, if we have the sort of fractal qualities of natural structures around us, that we can actually improve our health and well-being because, as it is posited, we have evolved in these kinds of environments, and we are wired, so to speak, to feel well and to feel that we are in salubrious or health-promoting environments. So our bodies react accordingly. Our stress levels go down. Our, some of our neurotransmitters improve. Some of our other chemical signal control signals improve, and lo and behold, our measurable health outcomes actually improve when we're in environments like this. By the way, the term biophilia was most popularized, I think, by Edward O. Wilson and his colleague Stephen Keller, who wrote a number of books on the topic, describing the idea that we have evolved in these kinds of environments. We love biological structures. That's the idea of biophilia, the love of nature, the love of natural structures and natural environments, which is where we've evolved and where we've spent most of our evolutionary history. As we were talking about yesterday, we've spent only a tiny amount of time of our evolutionary history in cities, let alone in the very industrial cities of only the last 300 years or so, and the very modern cities of only the last 100 years or so. So our bodies have not adapted to those kinds of environments. They've adapted to the natural environments that we spent tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions of years if you go back to pre-human species. And so that is an idea that I think a lot of landscape architects and landscape designers have thought about over the years and reacted to, in some cases just intuitively, the idea that, for example, you have prospect and refuge. You have a place where you can be safe in a refuge, and then you can look out on a prospect and you can see a distant view. And one of the hypotheses is that we feel comfortable in those environments because we can see if there's danger. If we were out on the savannah, for example, or we were up in a tree able to look out on the savannah, we could see if there were predators coming after us, or other hostile humans or whatever. And so we naturally feel that we want to be in environments like that. That's the theory, that's the hypothesis, and it seems to be borne out by the evidence that we certainly have measurable positive outcomes when we are in environments that offer prospect and refuge, and that offer some of the other related characteristics of a deflected vista and a panorama and the different kinds of environments. Again, you can see water, you can see sunlight, you can see vegetation, all of these characteristics that we find intuitively pleasing and intuitively promoting of our, and measurably promoting of our well-being. And so this has been an insight that designers have now begun to really incorporate in a much bigger way. First, really the most notable example was in healthcare design. This is actually a mixed-use development where a number of buildings have been sort of brought together around this kind of greenhouse-like structure. This is actually not a healthcare design per se, but it is a example of promoting greenery and sunlight, et cetera, especially important, of course, in the Nordic countries. And I think the Nordic countries have been doing this kind of thing for years because everybody understands how beneficial that is, how we crave to be around greenery, even when it's the dead of winter outside, if we can get to places like this. This is another example. You've seen probably a number of these green walls that are living structures that are little pockets of soil that host the plants, and the plants can grow and thrive on that wall. They're irrigation systems and so on, and they're brought right into the buildings, and they're quite wonderful. I'm sure you've probably seen these. This is the idea of biophilia brought right into the buildings. And as I said, really some of the earliest and the most well-studied examples are in healthcare environments. This is one in Michigan, very beautiful atrium, as you can see, and a place that patients and visitors and others can spend time in. There's the whole idea of a healing garden now bringing that into the healthcare environment. This is one in Alberta, another example of bringing greenery right into the hospital environment. And also bringing it right into the room. This happens to be an artificial view, which is maybe a little bit uncomfortable in a certain way, and yet it does have an effect. There are measurable effects if you have a artificial view of this kind versus a more an actual view of another building or of a blank wall. Remember Ulrich's study showing that that kind of environment is actually conducive to well-being. And you notice, by the way, that this room has had a lot of the sort of technical gizmos cleaned up and built into the walls so that you don't feel like you're in a laboratory or something. You feel like you're in a hotel room or a comfortable space that actually you can gather around your family, your friends, and so on, and be in a much more salubrious kind of environment. And of course, people are looking at that now in terms of the office environment and some of the awful places that we have created for office workers and for, for other users in so many of the environments we have today. And we're now seeing that if we can bring greenery and water and sunlight and other activities, biophilic activities into the environment, productivity goes up. Evidence-based design shows us that we can actually have measurable economic benefits from these kinds of changes to our environment. And the corollary of that, by the way, is that we are having negative economic impacts from the ways that we're doing things now. We've heard that theme before in some of the other things we've been talking about, the negative externalities of greenhouse gas emissions and so on, the negative externalities of pollution and resource depletion and so on, but also just creating ugly environments, it turns out, is having a negative economic impact and a negative impact on our well-being, which is also another negative economic impact if we're having to have more healthcare and so on. So a lot of architects have picked this up. You probably know Calatrava's work, which is very sort of biophilic and has this kind of quality of ribs or biological structures, ferns, or the fractal patterns that he uses a lot that I think are quite beautiful. I mean, you could argue whether or not it's too iconic and not sort of organized around human beings and mutable with human beings, but as iconic architecture, I do think he's tapped into something that is quite biophilic in a way. This is another one of his buildings in Chicago that has that sort of biophilic quality to it, biological, fractal, etc. The sort of fractal quality of ferns or of the ribs of a skeleton or something like that. And you can see these structures obviously in the human body and in many other biological structures in nature, the fractal qualities, the symmetries, different kinds of symmetries, by the way, not just reflectional, but axial and rotational and scaling and so on. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about symmetry as a phenomenon. But certainly it's something that we see in the natural world, and not only vegetation, but animals. We love to be around animals. So, pets are definitely positive health elements for human beings. But there are measurable outcomes, reduction of blood pressure and things like that when we're around animals, when we're around our pets. And when we experience their beauty, then they're sort of, wonderful patterning of their coats and so on. And this is something I talked about a little bit the other day about how that happens in the natural world, how it self-organizes into these very complex patterns. And again, this is something that we have experienced over, millions of years of our evolution, not only experiencing it in the sense that it's a biological process going on in our own bodies, but experiencing it as a perception when we're perceiving other animals in the built environment and experiencing their beauty, and also maybe experiencing the alarm signals that we say, wait a minute, that guy's a tiger, he's going to eat me, and I better run away from him. But you can also see the beauty and the fearful symmetry, as the poet Edmund Blake put it. Again, many other examples from biology that are very, very beautiful and that have these kind of geometric properties that are very biophilic. We love to be around these environments. We love to be around butterflies and hummingbirds and flowers and so on. And this is not just some, random romantic inclination. This is a biological phenomenon that we can measure, and it's a structural phenomenon that we can measure, and we can understand now how these structures are generated and how they arise from the processes of self-organization and the processes of algorithmic generativity. And so I think we understand a little more about how biophilia actually arises as a phenomenon, not just as something that is a strange thing out of left field, as it were, but something that makes a lot of sense given our evolutionary history of being around trees and tree trunks, being around plants and leaves and structures that we now are incorporating and have been incorporating over millennia into our architectures. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why we do that we can now comprehend. I gave you this example the other day. This is the British Museum, where they happen to have an exhibit outside, and they brought in actual trees and water and rocks and so on. And you can begin to see that relationship with the actual building. So this is not just about bringing in trees and water and rocks and so on. It's also about reflecting those kinds of geometries in the buildings themselves. You saw Calatrava, for example, reflecting those fern-like or rib-like patterns in the buildings themselves. And I think that's an important aspect of biophilia that we're beginning to address. And in the urban realm itself, you can see, I think I showed you this example also, this complex relationship, this place network of the different regions. This is in Glasgow. And also having the experience of other people. Other people are also biophilic. We love to be around other people and watch them and interact with them and feel the sidewalk ballet, as Jane Jacobs referred to it, and see the clothing and the colors and the patterns and the faces and the ways that people are interacting and expressing. And you can see the kid on his bike that's sort of grimacing because he's pedaling away, and the guy who's pushing the cart is sort of grimacing because he's pushing the cart, and then other people who are talking and smiling, and we love to be around those environments. They're very biophilic in their own way. And then, of course, in many other cultures, the same thing is true. This is by no means a European phenomenon. This is in Shanghai. The wonderful old stone buildings that they have there that, again, have a lot of these fractal qualities, as well as integrating the vegetation and so on. And other examples from China where, it's emulating the natural environment and sometimes reproducing the natural environment. These are stone structures that are meant to reproduce some of the mountain landscapes in China, and bringing in vegetation, bringing in these wonderful pagoda structures that have these very fractal qualities in the roof structures and in the ornamentation of them and so on. So this is a pan-cultural phenomenon that's going on all around the world. This is in Tibet, the example of the beautiful structures of the buildings that kind of emulate a mountain landscape in a way, the sort of lower pediment, and then the structures up above, and the order of the windows that are kind of like the patterning of the clouds, or the fractal qualities, and so on. These are all things that we all, I think, all find beautiful. Here's in India, of course, the Taj Mahal, the famous Taj Mahal, with a very fractal pattern to it, and very symmetrical, not only reflectional symmetry, but rotational symmetry, scaling symmetry, translational symmetry, where you have the repetition of elements and so on. Again, we'll talk about that a little more tomorrow. Here is in Iran, the Islamic architecture that is often incredibly fractal, with the repetition of motifs, and also, by the way, not only literally repeating the motifs at different scales, but also exploiting perspective to do the same thing. So you have, you notice that there are a couple of different arch structures in the actual design, and then there's the repetition of that arch structure down the hall as you're looking at it in perspective. So it's exploiting the fractal qualities that you get just from perspective, that when you have a translational symmetry, it becomes a scaling symmetry in perspective. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow as well. Really beautiful stuff. This is, I think, in Egypt, more Islamic architecture. And as you may know, in religious architecture in the Islamic world, it's not allowed to use images of people or animals usually. And so you have these wonderful complex geometries that are actually very fractal and are loaded with different kinds of symmetries, as we'll talk about tomorrow. And we find that very beautiful, and we find that very health inducing, health supporting, salutogenic, as is the term. Generating of our health and our well-being, and of course of our spiritual awareness and our spiritual feeling, which is why it's used so commonly in religious architectures around the world. And a number of people have tried to incorporate some of that. This is the famous 30 St. Mary Axe in London, known as the Gherkin, designed by Foster and Associates, and it's got this sort of fractal pine cone quality to it. In my mind, it's not nearly as beautiful as some of the other structures we've been looking at, partly because of the sort of severe industrial geometries, but it's trying, it's moving in that direction. It's trying to sort of generate these fractal and symmetrical orbital spiral relationships that you see in the natural world. And this is the Scottish Parliament building where he's trying to do the same thing, trying to use leaf patterns, abstracted versions of leaf patterns, and reflect those and rotate those and so on, and do many other things. I would say it's fairly primitive in comparison to some of the really beautiful and very, very intricate and complex examples we saw earlier. This is sort of a stilted new version, industrial version, crude industrial version of that, but it's again moving in that direction, trying to be more biophilic. Frank Gehry's work is certainly more biophilic in the sense that it has more of those fractal properties. This is the Bilbao project that he did, the Guggenheim Museum, where you have many repetitions of a particular form at different scales and different levels and different tiers, again, using the perspective to sort of force the scaling symmetries and other experiences of that very complex structure. This is the Petronas Tower in Kuala Lumpur, where you can see a very fractal pattern going on there, a very traditional pattern, by the way, an Islamic pattern of a quatrefoil, which is essentially a star pattern with a series of semicircles inserted into it. And quite a striking structure, a very iconic structure, of course, and lots of symmetries, lots of biophilic properties to that. Other examples that I think personally are less successful, Libeskind's work, where he's trying to, again, break up the forms into more fractal elements, different scales, different sizes, different pieces. I personally think that he's gone a little bit over the bend here and gotten into a sort of almost a nightmarish kind of architecture, very disorienting. In fact, some of the studies that show what happens to people in environments like the one on the lower right is that they become very disoriented and they actually become seasick. So it's possible to push this all too far and to actually result in negative outcomes in terms of the well-being of the people who are there, especially when you're trying maybe a little too hard to be attention-getting and iconic and, you know, expressing your angst about the world through your art and whatever. That is okay up to a point. That's fine in a gallery. That's fine. But come on, you're out in the public realm. You're forcing everybody in the public realm in the city to experience what you're doing. And if they happen to not be well already, you maybe are making them even more ill at ease. And that is, I think, a form of malpractice, to be blunt about it. Here's another example. This is actually an example from Peter Eisenman, where the city of culture in Galicia, Spain, near Santiago de Compostela. And what he has done here is he has taken you can see the organic village on the right here, and he has taken some abstract components of that and generated a new structure up here on the upper left, which is the city of culture, the buildings that are part of this museum complex, essentially. And that is a kind of biophilia in a way, a kind of using the generativity of the natural environment and the natural human environment, the traditional human environment, to generate a new structure. Once again, I would say that the level of success is questionable, because it's not this extremely complex, intricate, self-organizing structure that you see in, for example, this is Ronda in Spain, another part of Spain, actually. It's one artist's static creation, what you see on the lower right. It's one person saying, I'm going to take some of the abstract properties of a natural environment, and then I'm going to generate an artistic creation, a gigantic sculpture in effect, and then I'm going to force human beings to live in that gigantic sculpture, and I'm going to hope that they like it. And guess what? The research doesn't tend to support that very well, as compared to this vastly more complex structure, the structure that was generated by, remember, distributed agents over time, over decades and centuries. Remember Habraken's point about the importance of agents being distributed and being empowered to help to fit and shape the environment and shape the language of that environment through the kinds of patterns that they use, the kinds of traditional languages that they use and share and develop over and refine and evolve over many decades and many centuries. That is actually a more complex environment. It has a much higher degree of organized complexity than that environment on the lower right. I'm sorry, I don't have photos of Santiago of the City of Culture, but you can Google it. If you Google Eisenman City of Culture, you can see some of the buildings for yourself. But again, this is what's going on in the natural environment, as we were talking about the other day. This is what's going on in morphogenesis, the ways that the structures of the natural environment are generated, biological structures as well as non-biological structures, and the particular geometries that they have. The symmetry breaking, as I'll talk about more tomorrow, that generates new forms of symmetry and new structures that have particular properties, particular geometric characteristics, and they are the ones that we find particularly beautiful and particularly meaningful as human beings when we see the morphogenesis of a limb, for example, and the local symmetries and the levels of scale and the strong centers and all the other geometric properties that arise through that process. And the same thing goes on in our built environments as well. This is an example that Christopher Alexander showed of Venice, Italy, and how that environment also went through a kind of morphogenesis over many years and gradually articulated and transformed. And we were talking about that the other day, how Venice has been transforming and self-organizing in many ways. And the same thing in Rome. You can see with the Noli plan of Rome, we talked about that yesterday, many other environments throughout history that create these transformations over time, these structure preserving transformations. And Christopher Alexander talked about that. These are examples from his book, The Nature of Order. Then he talks about, for example, the Golden Gate Bridge, that building, that structure on the lower right, where you had this passage, the Golden Gate, and there were ways that one could come in there and build a bridge and create something that added to and enriched and made that that entire structure, the natural structure and the built structure, far stronger. And he calls that a structure preserving transformation. In other words, he's enhancing and preserving the structure that's there already, rather than, creating an object that is distracting from that natural environment. It's harmonious. It fits in and it enriches in a certain way, even though it's a very man-made structure very clearly. And a lot of these other structures are like that too. The church, I think that's a Romanian church, maybe on the upper left, that is very not exactly blending into the landscape, and yet it's very harmonious with the landscape because of its fractal properties and its biophilic properties, lifelike properties. And we've seen how pattern languages are meant to recapitulate some of those characteristics and give us a design tool to allow us to recapitulate some of those characteristics. And we talked also about the fractal properties and how they're generated through a very simple algorithm. And this is a point that Christopher Alexander also made, that the sequence of steps is really what's critical, the algorithm. And it can be quite simple at its heart. It's not necessarily the time span, because if you can go really fast with a computer and generate a fractal pattern, in milliseconds, or you can go very slow in the example of a city that's evolving over decades and centuries, but it's the same kind of iteration, the adaptive iteration, where at each step it adapts to what happened before, and the next step it adapts to what happened before, and the next step it adapts to what happened before, and gradually builds up this very, very complex fractal pattern, a self-organizing pattern, as we saw with the cellular automata. And so it has to be continuously interactive and iterative. It's not just one design phase, not by one designer or one design team. It's a sequence of steps that has to be iterative. And it's not just top down, as we saw. It's got to be bottom up. You've got to incorporate both of those, perhaps. And DNA is not a little blueprint. It's more like a recipe, a coded series of steps that creates the structure, creates the morphogenesis. And we saw how Alexander was describing how different kinds of processes generate different kinds of geometric structure that are very, very common in the natural world and in the human world, the traditional world. And there's things that we can tap into. We can understand how these are happening and how these are very biophilic, how we love to be around them, because we have been around them throughout our evolutionary history, around these beautiful landscapes of vegetation and mountains and clouds and so on. And here's a paper that's very interesting. Alexandros Lavdas, who's a neuroscientist in Bolzano in Italy. And what he's pointing out here is that organized complexity, remember that was Jacob's term, is in fact correlated mathematically and in terms of the neuroscience with aesthetic preference. We can now draw a one-to-one relationship between those. There's evidence linking exposure to natural environments to favorable changes in mental and even physical health. That's the biophilia observation that we've been talking about. There's also a growing body of work indicating specific geometric properties, the fractal properties, the other kinds of properties that we're maybe not doing so well these days in our industrialization of the built environment. And maybe that's just a sort of a crude early phase of the industrial technology, and we need to grow beyond that, right? And these are geometries that are associated with aesthetic preference as well as well-being. We seem to like what is good for us. And again, that supports the biophilia hypothesis that we've evolved in these environments, that we need to understand these structural features that mediate these effects. That's something going on in the science world, and also has a great practical importance for us as designers. And that we need to incorporate these biophilic properties, as I think you can see from everything else I've been talking about in this talk. And it is very interesting to find that it exists not only in the natural world, but again, in pre-modern architecture, because maybe we instinctively, intuitively, built those kinds of places because we gradually felt our way through, and were able, because we were so close to those environments and shaping them more directly and without the sort of mediating abstractions and abstract technologies, that we were able to create a much sort of richer and more satisfying and more health promoting kind of environment. So now we need to figure out ways to reintegrate those properties and understand how they are embedded as integral parts of the design, or from the materials or the construction methods, the processes of shaping those environments. And the existence of that structural order may in fact be a reflection of structural and functional patterns of our own nervous system. And this is where we get into the neuroscience that I want to talk about, that our wiring, if you will, is tuned. Our perceptive system is tuned to certain types of visual organization. We can perceive, for example, faces very, very well. We're highly evolved to read other people's faces and to read what kinds of emotions they have. This is very important for us as social beings, obviously, also important to us in terms of our safety, whether they're angry or threatening, or whether they're appealing, or maybe they're going to be a good mate for us or whatever. And this is a study in empirical aesthetics, and examining individual parameters and examining their effects is a first step, so that we can expand our research in this area and pursue the investigation further. So, as I said, I want to focus a little more now on the neuroscience and what we're learning from actually studying the brains of people when they're reacting to their environments, because that too is reinforcing a lot of our understanding, a lot of our environmental psychology work on evidence-based design and positive health effects, positive effects of people being willing to linger and walk and interact and so on in certain kinds of environments and not others. And this is work by Samir Zeki, who's a neurobiologist at University College London. And he points out how we seek to satisfy the quality of beauty because it actually nourishes our emotional brain. That's a really interesting idea that he talks about in more detail, and I'll explain that in a little more detail. From a neurobiological point of view, all areas of the brain must be continually nourished, in other words, stimulated by the things that we see and experience in the physical world in a way that corresponds to their specific functions. We see things, we hear things, we touch things, we find them beautiful, we find them interesting, they engage us, they allow us to exercise our brains and to nourish our brains, as he says. And so if we're deprived of that, if we're put in an isolation room, we suffer. That's why one of the worst things you can do to a human being is to put them in isolation, to solitary confinement. That is a terrible thing to do to a human being. And this is why, because we crave to be stimulated by our environments and by being with other people and other kinds of activities going on. And beauty is a central element of this, he says. It adds to the health of the individuals and to society's well-being. It is not a luxury, but an essential ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain. I'm going to emphasize that point. Not a luxury, but an essential ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain. Now, this is interesting because here's a neurobiologist talking about beauty. And beauty is a word that we've almost banished from the world of architecture because we tend to think of it as socially constructed and in the eye of the beholder and so on and so forth. Well, this is what is now in the neuroscience studies being disproven. It turns out that there's a high degree of correlation between different people as to what they experience as beautiful. And moreover, it's the same areas of the brain that are actually being activated. We can now look at the brain and see what's happening when somebody says, "Oh, that's beautiful." It turns out that when they say, "Oh, that's beautiful," what they're only describing is, "Oh, there's something going on in my brain, in a certain region of my brain that is an excitation, that is a certain kind of experience or a certain kind of reaction that I'm having to that environment." It's a structural phenomenon in the brain, a structural phenomenon that is hardwired into us through our evolutionary history to recognize something going on in the built environment, some kind of order, some kind of organized complexity, as Lavdos was saying. And it's in the orbitofrontal cortex that's, as they say, differentially engaged, during the perception of beautiful versus ugly stimuli, regardless of the category, and that the perception of stimuli as beautiful or ugly mobilizes the motor cortex differentially. In other words, when I say, ooh, that's ugly, something else is going on in my brain, and we can measure that now. And there's a lot of work on that. Zeki and others have done work on it. And there's a lot of other neuroscience that's emerging on that. And this goes back, way back really, to Edmund Burke, for example, back in the 1700s, was talking about beauty as some quality in bodies acting mechanically upon the human mind by the intervention of the senses. Well, Burke got some flack for that over the centuries, that this is too deterministic and too mechanistic. But now the neuroscience is actually restoring Burke's view, if you will, that there is a kind of mechanism or a kind of process that is structural, and we can understand it. We can understand the structural components of it. We can understand what is likely to trigger it and what is not likely to trigger it. Remember, going back to Ulrich, we can study the health outcomes when somebody can see vegetation and so on, a nice landscape. And there's a lot more research that has emerged since Ulrich's study in 1984 to really reinforce that. And now, of course, the new research on neuroscience that's confirming that view. Also, the issue of stress. Stress is something that we deal with now at a level that is way, way beyond what it once was, because what the normal patterns of stress for the human animal is stress goes up, you fight or flight, then stress goes down. We now have something that's unique in our evolutionary history, and that is continuous low-grade stress from our environments. And there have been a lot of studies on that, studies of, for example, what happens in when we're on the road, when we're in our cars and experiencing stress on our commutes, and then we get to work. What are the impacts of our productivity? They're measurable. If we're in an ugly environment, if we're in a traffic jam the whole way, our blood pressure's up, our stress levels are up, our performance is lower. It actually has an impact, again, on our productivity because the aesthetics of the environment actually has an impact, not just whether we're in a traffic jam and we're angry because we're late, but also whether it's ugly. Actually has a measurable impact. And this is what Parsons et al. Did this study of looking at the experience of commuters, whether they had a nature-dominated drive or an artifact-dominated drive, buildings and highways and concrete and so on. And there was a measurable difference, and a lot of other studies have shown similar results. And of course, the ability to walk, the willingness to walk, is directly related to the beauty of the walking experience, the biophilic quality of the walking experience. And that has also been measured and documented pretty clearly. And again, we can look now at the neuroscience and we can see that there are really two processes going on. One is based on the objective parameters, the fractal characteristics, the vegetation and so on, what they call the embodied natural beauty, and also the social construction. There is indeed a social construction aspect to this. Architects in particular clearly have some social construction about what they consider beautiful, what we as designers consider beautiful. What's of interest to us now, what is it, what we're all talking about and looking at in the magazines might be the thing that we find more beautiful because it's in our minds, it's something that we're interested in, and it's socially constructed. And that is a component of beauty that we're experiencing. But if you were to think about it in this way, you might think that we all share a common biological root. This is what the neuroscience is showing us and what the environmental psychology is showing us. And then we are all experiencing a certain amount of social construction that, if you like, differentiates that common biological root, like the branches coming off of a tree trunk, right? And the point of that is that most people are still going to be pretty tightly grouped in the middle there. And then you're going to have outliers who are maybe people who are have particular unique social constructions, whether they're architects or they're artists or they're some small community of people who have a different way of looking at things. And this is beginning to explain what we saw earlier, the divergence between architects and users and planners and users and other professionals and users. And it begins to show us, again, this lens model that I've referred to earlier, that shows us how specialists of various kinds can diverge from the bulk of the population of users that they are supposed to be serving. And this, I think, also helps us to understand how we need to be careful in our social constructions as professionals and in the ways that we diverge from the population that we are responsible for serving in our professional role, our role of professional duty, and the duty of care to their well-being. Because I think we can now see that there is a direct impact on the well-being of those users that are maybe in the middle population there. It's not all social construction. There are biological roots to all of this that maybe are not fully changed by the social construction. Another related area of research that's very interesting is looking at how people actually visually take in an environment, how their eyes actually move through the environment and scan that environment and experience it in different ways. And it turns out that the structure itself will affect the ways that people will look at it and experience it, the ways that their eyes will actually track it. And we can do that now by using eye tracking technology. You know, there are these devices that marketing professionals have been using for some time now to see which advertisement triggers the biggest arousal and the biggest sort of eye movement and so on, or whether, you know, if you put the potato chips at just this point of the rack, are the people walking by there, are they going to look at that, you know, so am I going to sell more potato chips and so on. And that is also something that we are now applying to best practice in environmental design, to say, well, how about a building or a landscape? How do people take that in, and where do their eyes fall? And do they see what I, the designer, think they see? Or are they actually even looking at it? And it turns out that, for example, this is not particularly surprising, but it is confirmed by the software, by the eye tracking systems, that people don't look at blank facades, no matter how you know, dramatic they might be or shocking they might be or whatever. The eyes simply don't move to those things. They move naturally to the more fractal parts of the composition, the more intricate parts of the composition that are also more biophilic and, again, more naturalistic perhaps in certain ways. And so this is an important issue when we're thinking about how people understand their built environment, how they take in their built environment, how they are impacted by those environments. And I think we as planners need to think about that, planners and architects and designers and builders and developers and policy people. We are in sub-communities, sometimes parochial communities, communities that are very focused on particular aspects of a problem that are not shared by the bulk of the people that are using the results that we build, the places that we make for them. And so, again, if we want to make more delightful buildings, more salubrious buildings, buildings that are better for the well-being of the users, the health even of the users, the willingness of them to walk and to interact socially and to do all the things that we hope they will do in our buildings and in our urban environments, then we need to work on this problem. We need to recognize the nature of this problem, as Gifford and Brown and the others can have been talking about. There's many other studies, examples of that. Here's another one. Architects and non-architects differ from each other. environmental preferences. Here's one that shows a little bit more of the social construction aspects. Environmental preferences are not solely determined by the characteristics of individuals, but instead are socially constituted. And, part of the issue is the way, for example, I know this, having been trained in architecture myself, and my PhD is actually in architecture, that the studio culture, the culture of doing crits and so on, is a very unique kind of experience that allows the social construction of what we think is valuable in architecture that might be very different from what the vast majority of users are going to experience in those kinds of buildings, that we as architects are in a kind of subculture, or we might say disparagingly, a kind of cult, really, that is looking at things in only a certain way that is not shared by everybody else that is going to be using those places that we build. And that is a very important issue when it comes to professional responsibility. And that these people go on to talk about in looking at different categories and thinking about buildings, which may well result from the specialized training. But this study looks at the differences in aesthetic criteria and how those are different in terms of the physical environments and the cognitive judgments that people make, and how we can begin to understand as different communities and sort of bridge the divides between these different communities, and understand, for example, how users experience certain kinds of environments, and perhaps not be quite so disparaging of users who like certain kinds of traditional characteristics. For example, if those are conducive to their well-being, perhaps we need to maybe incorporate those in a way that we still find satisfying as professionals, but also satisfy the users, because it's ultimately for them that we're building. I mentioned this concept of construal levels and construal level theory and psychological distance. This is something that is used a lot in the marketing world and in looking at consumer behavior, for example, but it can also be applied to professionals, and how professionals who are removed from a particular environment, removed from the context of that environment, must insert their own construals in place of what somebody might be experiencing if they're actually there on the ground in that place. So, you think about the ways that traditional environments, or environments throughout, let's not call them traditional environments, let's just talk about the vast bulk of human environments over the vast span of human history and human cultures, that they experience them in a much more direct way, and that it's only in a tiny fraction of a percent of human experience and human lifespan, human existence, that we have created a technological approach that is much more removed from the actual experience of the building by the users, that we are now off in office buildings somewhere remote, and we're off in classrooms and off in our own little world with our own abstractions and our own ways of dealing with the environment. It blows my mind sometimes that people will plan whole buildings or whole landscapes without ever setting foot on that spot, without ever talking to the users, or even inserting themselves into that community and trying to experience what that community is experiencing, because that is ultimately what you're designing for, right? You're designing for the experience of the people who are there. And I think that's something that we need to develop better methodologies to understand how to do that more effectively. And that's something that I think is happening slowly in the world of design and in the world of architecture and planning and related fields. And certainly, as I said before, and as we've talked about, the scientific world, the world of research, environmental psychology and neuroscience and so on, is way ahead of us in many ways. And there's a whole lot that we can learn that I think I hope you're seeing from this course is really astonishing, and in many ways, I think, mind-blowing and wonderful. And it gives me hope frankly, because we have great challenges that we're facing right now for our cities and for our culture, for our sustainability, for our technology, really. And yet we have great resources now at our disposal to be able to take up these challenges and apply these insights to make real progress in getting some of the characteristics that we now know we need if we're going to have truly healthy, durable, sustainable environments. So on that note, let's spend a few more minutes discussing and reviewing. Anna, do you want to maybe start first and give me your thoughts and questions, comments, ideas?
Yeah, sure. I will try. Sorry about my voice.
Yeah, don't worry if you're unable to talk or we'll
maybe just one short comment. I remember while reading the theory of architecture, I was interested in this saying that the human eye is actually trained to catch a detail, read the scale, and this is how we process the environment and feel safe in it. And what I think is maybe the first cases of modernism was not, well, while I examine those houses and I find them beautiful, it might be because they kind of emphasize the context, and the detail came from the environment, the light, the shadow, the nature, basically. So what I've learned during my architectural practice, I was lucky enough to be in the office where the head architect had this saying that you can conservate architecture through your design. So you can design a building that acts like a background. And when something is full of detail, you can simply just back off. And this is a very mature decision and very, well, hard for an architect to do, I think. But when you're in this context of a beautiful nature, maybe the modern niche facade is not necessarily the worst that can happen. Again, when the modern building is placed in a beautiful environment, the light, the shadow, the trees, the environment itself is so appealing that it might affect in the fact that the modern building is more human itself. So I would like to hear your opinion on that. Maybe we need this contrast between the detail and non-detail. I've seen that you've showed that naturally the eye goes through to the more fractal, more fragmented parts of the building, but I also believe that they need this blank space to truly like shine, right? So maybe that was part of the case, right? Do I get that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we have to understand the evolution of our profession and what has been positive about it. And as we were talking about before, we can see that going back to Ebenezer Howard, for example, and the City Beautiful, that these were people who were reformers. They were trying to improve the condition of humanity, and there was great idealism and great, awareness of the challenges that human beings had and the dedication to dealing with those. And that was certainly true of the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was a German phenomenon, and in many ways it was the counterpart of the arts and crafts movement in England at that time. The Bauhaus was a little bit different from the arts and crafts movement in England in that it relied more upon the methods of engineering and the methods of abstraction, you might say, mathematics, and whereas I think the English arts and crafts was a little more focused on how you engage artisans in crafting the built environment. For the Bauhaus, it was more about improving the lot of the worker who maybe wasn't a great craftsperson, and that the craftsperson was the designer now, and the workers were just laying up bricks or doing, and the building was now a much simpler structure. There was an elegance in that simplicity. And I think one of the key ideas behind that was that the building is now a kind of background. I guess that's the point that you were asking about, is the building is a habitat where you bring in artwork and vegetation and I think in many cases, this is where modernist buildings are most successful as the kind of backdrop of, for example, artwork in an art museum or environments that have very beautiful textiles and other materials. I also think the Nordic countries have probably done the best job of creating biophilic environments, as I mentioned before, because they already recognize the value of sunlight, which they don't get a lot of in the wintertime, and vegetation being enclosed in, well-lit greenhouse-like structures and so on, and using natural materials, a lot of wood, the work of Aalto, for example, or other Nordic architects that is quite biophilic, actually, and also lends itself, I think, to supporting this backdrop and supporting the context for salubrious living, really. And I think that's something that, it's not a new thing. It's not like all of our environments have been just trying to be icons or whatever. But iconitis, or the effort to create objects, has been a kind of runaway problem in the field, along with this sort of postmodern ennui, or this sense that we are no longer idealistic about what our professions can do. And this is something that I think, the Bauhaus certainly was very idealistic. There was a desire, if you read Gropius, for example, Gropius's writing, he's very much of a humanist and a person who wants to see architecture support well-being and human flourishing and so on. But that idealism was lost because, frankly, there was a recognition of some of the mistakes that were made, some of the things that were missing from that kind of approach to architecture that we're now beginning to recognize and beginning, I think, to add back in and maybe enrich. Again, you don't necessarily go back and throw away and become a reactionary, but you go forward and you build on and you add to, and maybe that's what we need to do now in terms of our architecture and how we take the things that we have now in terms of the resources of the profession and add to them from what we're learning in the sciences and from other fields, and maybe add to them from the history of architecture, the history of human experience in a richer way, and not be quite so ready to accept the cult-like belief that everything prior to 1920 should be rejected, which is no more valid than the idea that everything in the middle of the 20th century should be rejected. I think what we now recognize from an evolutionary point of view and from a biophilic point of view, from an evidence-based point of view, is that we need every source of good solutions we can find. We need as much good genetic material as we can find in order to focus on the goals that we need, the challenges that we need to address, the promoting walkability, promoting mixed use, promoting thriving urban environments, thriving building environments that people can help to control and to shape and to interact with in ways that are more conducive to their well-being. You remember Amartya Sen's quote that I gave to you earlier: "You have to show me how it promotes people's freedom and the freedom to be well, and not only to be well, but to live the kind of life that they themselves value leading, give them power to become these distributed agents and to be able to work out the conflicts that their freedoms might have with one another, all those sorts of things. So I think the ultimate takeaway from this understanding of the what's emerging in the sciences is very optimistic, actually very hopeful. Not to say it's going to be a piece of cake to apply all of these insights, but I do think it's hopeful, and I do think it's very enriching of our practice as designers as we think about that. Dominic, do you want to add or comment, or what? Before you do, Anna, do you want to add anything more to that?
No, not really. One thing maybe that I came across, I don't know if you're familiar with the Baker Miller pink case. It was the color very bright pink that in Switzerland, I believe, they painted the jails because they believed it was based on study that it's a calming color, but nevertheless they didn't knew that it's calming for the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then it became even more stressful for the people inside it. So I think that I also tried. It just, for me, it was a reminder to be careful with the studies and always process it through the design idea. And I cannot believe that someone conscious believe that it's a good idea to paint the whole room in the one color, but apparently they did, and the effect was tragic. That's it. That's all I have to say for today.
That's a really good point, I think, and this is true with evidence-based design in general. You know, that you have to be careful not to look at one study or one finding or one anything. I think the healthcare profession is a good model in many ways, not a perfect model, but a good one, because again, they don't look at just one study. They try to look at multiple studies. They try to get as many data points as they can and try to understand how, well, if there's something that, you know, is a hot new thing, a hot new trend, maybe you have to be a little careful with it because there might be a unintended consequence down the line, right? And you need to understand, for example, you need to do multiple studies with different populations. That's why they're so careful with, you know, drug testing, for example, and other things that they want to have time to see what the long-term impacts are and whether there are unintended consequences that are going to emerge. But it also, to your point about color, you know, there's so many fascinating aspects of this, and color is one of those, of course. And color is certainly a major influence on what we experience and why we experience certain things. And for example, the fast food restaurants have known for a long time that red and yellow tend to trigger hunger. And you know, that's why you'll see McDonald's and Burger King and so on. They use those colors a lot. And there is something there, something going on. And I think also we can sometimes look to the marketing world and the advertising world to see where things are emerging, because often they're the first to jump on it, because it's an economic benefit to them when they can, you know, you saw that with eye tracking software, you see it with color studies and other things where they're kind of ahead of the game in terms of understanding how it affects behavior, but also, by the way, in a very self-serving way, which is something that I think we should be careful about, because, you know, obviously, triggering people's hunger to go eat a bunch of hamburgers might not end up, in terms of long-term health benefits, might not be such a good thing. And so I think our role is more in the role of healthcare providers. We're professionals. We have a duty of care to our users to promote their health and well-being, not just in the moment, not to make them feel good. You know, we could give them drugs and make them feel very good, and they wouldn't be healthy in the long term. What we need to do is promote their long-term well-being and their own capacity to promote their own well-being, like through their immune system, through their own choices and their own life chances and life development. Dominic, any comments?
Yes, overall, during your lecture today, you have again touched on a great deal of interdisciplinary content, so I can see how much all areas of science are connected. In reality, the division of disciplines into science, engineering, humanities, social sciences, and so on is only contractual, because in the world everything comes together, as I can see, and forms a logical whole. Because of time, and now I would like to concentrate more on one of the aspects discussed by you today, so a brain. I think that the brain is one of the most fascinating human organs. The very fact of how all the information is stored in the brain is complex and extremely intriguing. And the way the brain works, the fact that in our organism there are electrical impulses in brain, as well as the algorithm they can appear, is something amazing. The brain is responsible for so many things, for feelings that are commonly attributed to the heart actually arise in the brain, memory. The brain creates imagination, and as Einstein used to say, imagination is more important than knowledge because knowledge is limited. Yeah, the power of the brain is so great that it can affect also our health. For instance, placebo, people can physically feel what they think they should feel, and so on.
Yeah.
The role of the brain is also evidenced by the fact that with certain mental problems or illnesses, people are unable to function at all and focus on other things, even if they are physically perfectly healthy.
Right.
So there's a lot to learn about brain operations, and I personally believe that despite such a vast and already available knowledge, what we know about the brain is still just a drop in the ocean. Fortunately, there is a growing body of research and science focusing on the brain, for instance, cognitive science. And through such sciences and the development of knowledge about the brain, we contribute to the development, in turn, of neural networks and cognitive technologies, including artificial intelligence. Hence, we have then a chance to solve better, more complex problems, and so on. Neuroscience has also established itself in other areas. From the didactic point of view, neurodidactics is becoming increasingly popular, for instance. The brain is also, for me, the basis of psychology, which in turn underpins human relationships and therefore relational capital. And while studying relational capital, it is necessary to take into consideration not only economic factors, but also psychological ones, which is why this organ plays a vital role in the subject of relationships. Thus, it is a huge, broad topic, and you mentioned it in the next context, so in the context of architecture and urban planning. And thanks to it, I had a chance to understand the matter of brain possibilities in other areas still much better. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is so fascinating, isn't it? And I would encourage you guys to explore and read up more on what's emerging when it comes to our experiences of our environments. And one of the things I didn't really touch on today is the aspect of bounded rationality. That this is what Herbert Simon coined that phrase. The things that we don't experience often in our environments that are right there in front of us, our cognition is very limited, actually, and our ability to perceive the world and what actually impacts us and doesn't impact us, and I should say also our conscious awareness is very limited. And sometimes what happens is that there are other forms of awareness that we're not conscious of. This is a very old insight going back to Freud and even maybe before. And the idea that we actually need to try to explore that a little more and understand how things are affecting us. Obviously, the health impacts that we aren't consciously aware of is one example of that. But also the things that we think that we're expressing to other people as architects, for example, and they're just completely not getting it all, because not only that they don't share our aesthetic judgment, but they don't see them. They're cognitively blind to them, and we are cognitively blind to their concerns. We remember what Gifford said in one of his papers, that architects actually cannot predict what lay people experience in the built environment. You cannot see it. My friend Nikos Salingaros and I referred to it as architectural myopia, that you see what you already see and you don't see the thing that's beyond that. There's an old saying also that you can't learn what you think you already know. And that's part of a broader issue, which is that when the brain is sort of loaded up with one set of perceptions or cognitions about the world, other things don't necessarily get in, and so you don't see those things. So I think that's an important component of understanding how we experience the built environment, how we experience the world. So again, there's so much in this field that's so fascinating and wonderful, and I think important as well, to be able to understand how we as professionals can be more effective and more also more successful in building environments where people are thriving and we're meeting their needs and we're creating more sustainability and all of the other things that we all know we have to do. So on that note, that's a good place to stop, and we're going to pick it up again this time on Saturday. So I'll see you all Saturday. I'm sorry to come into your Saturday afternoons, but I don't know if you have class on Saturday normally, but this week we're going to do that. So we'll see you then.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
You too.
Thank you.